Hello, everyone. Hope everyone is well. There's big news in Chicago with the opening of the city. The bars are opening today. So for those people who like to go to bars, this looked like good news until they put out the details. And the details are that you can't stand in a bar. You have to sit on a stool or a chair. They have tables that have to be able to fit 6 people, but only 4 can sit there. And the bar stools at the bar are 6 feet apart, and they kick you out after 2 hours. Not sure how they monitor that, but that's the news from Chicago today. That those who like to go to bars theoretically look like they're going to be happy, but my guess is they're not so happy. So I want to talk about a number of things. I want to talk about the Fed and the Treasury and bankruptcies and why this policy is flawed. I want to look at the data on GDP and the most recent retail sales, which got a lot of hype, and relate all that to the stock market. Talk about why all of that, why the stock market is reacting, and perhaps a way to think about that. In prepping the things that we've talked about a number of short papers on the things that have changed, we did some work on the efficient frontier, and I just want to give you some high-level stuff from that, and then I want to talk about a little bit about technology and how the world may change. So, as you know, the Treasury set up a special purpose vehicle, and the Fed funded that vehicle, and that is buying bonds and ETFs. And this is the worst idea that we've ever heard. It actually violates the charter of the Fed. And the Fed is actually doing what I think they should be doing. So they're buying agencies and Treasury bonds, they're trying to keep liquidity and order in that market. But what they did with the Treasury really has taken people's idea of risk completely out of the case. Katie Koch at Goldman Sachs said, "Buy stocks, the Fed has your back." This is what Mohamed Al-Arian said earlier this week. It does not matter what happens to the fundamentals. It does not matter what happens to corporate earnings. It does not matter what happens to the economic growth, because the Fed will buy what I want to buy. And this is the mindset of the investor today. So, and Howard Marks said, capitalism without bankruptcy is like Catholicism without hell. And the bankruptcies are critically important. What they do is they allow for companies with new technology to replace companies with old technology, and they allow for highly levered ideas that didn't work to be part of our past. And so, and there's lots of history of it. Kodak invented the digital camera, but the year they did, the chairman said that they were in the chemicals and paper business, and what they missed was that they weren't in the chemicals and paper business. They were in the family memory business, and the digital camera was going to revolutionize everything in an ad. Blockbuster, we remember when we used to go to Blockbuster, they required you to go to their store, pick up your movie, take it back, and pay a late fee if you didn't get there on time. Netflix said, that's too much work. And so they first used to deliver these things by mail. But Blockbuster had the chance twice to buy Netflix and turned it down. In fact, the chairman said of Blockbuster that Netflix wasn't even on their radar. They could have bought Netflix for billion market cap, and about 4 years later, it was $150 billion market cap. So, and there's likely all kinds of companies that have no earnings. Actually, the best estimate is 40% of small cap stocks and 20% of large cap stocks do not report earnings. Now, you can play with that, so it likely they're profitable, but and they certainly pay salaries and their bills and all of those types of things. But some of them should be having trouble. And so this policy that we're just going to keep stocks up and not let them fail through this treasury vehicle is insane. So let's just look at what the data says. GDP in 2019 was 21 trillion. Q1 GDP was down 4.8%. We don't know what it's going to be down in Q2, but the best guess is 30. So you wouldn't take 70% of it. It's 30% for the quarter. But that still gets you from 21 trillion to 19 trillion. So if we have 3% GDP growth, it'll take 4 years to get back to even. In 2008, and if you look at the earnings of the S&P, you have exactly the same thing. So the earnings of the S&P were thought to be 160. The best estimate is they're going to be 125. If we had 10% earnings growth, it would take 3 years to get back to even. And there's all types of people who are very nonchalantly suggesting to everybody that earnings for the S&P are going to be $163 in 2021. There's going to have to be some miracle performed for that to happen. If you look at 2008, the earnings of the S&P went from $82 to $49. So they were down in round numbers 40%. And it was the end of 2010 before they got back to that level. And so the same thing's going to happen now. This is worse than 2008. We call it the global financial crisis. This is worse than the global financial crisis. And so I think this is, with the loan to the Treasury, this is what the Fed wants to avoid. The Fed, wants to get everything back to where we were. We're not going back to where we were. Now, if you're the Treasury Secretary and you work for the current president, maybe you could come up with some ideas that would be that would encourage the stock market to look pretty good as you get to the election. For some of you, you will say that I'm somewhat cynical, but the market is completely ignoring all this. You heard that the market went up pretty dramatically after retail sales jumped in May by 17%. This is the problem with the headlines. It is that reporters don't look into the facts. 67% of retail sales historically have been driven by the top 25% of wage earners. In that group, retail sales in the month of May was up in a very minor way. It was people who went back to spending, who were really spending for necessities that made that number go up. So we really have got to analyze, the details of all of the headlines, and not just, look at a headline that says things are up 17%. The market's going to go up for that, and it looks like the response of a lot of investors are doing that. So. There is economic good news. It's great that retail sales are up. You also see the stock market respond to when somebody says they're going to have a vaccine. So our question is, when will they get the vaccine? And when can they manufacture enough units of the vaccine so people will find it happens? So, there's a lot of what ifs and what whens that are out there. So what's going to happen in the stock market when GDP is actually reported and we can see GDP down 30% or some number like that? What happens if there's spikes in corona? What happens if any state returns to quarantine? What will happen when Q2, Q3, Q4 earnings are actually come out? And so we think the assumptions of GDP growth and S&P earnings are not as rosy as they are being presented. So we think this is the time for caution. This is the greatest economic calamity since the Depression. And it created a stock market that went down 31% for 35 days and then went back to even. Just seems completely disproportionate to us. And so that's why we're cautious. That's why we advise you to look into the facts, etc. So I want to shift gears a little bit and just talk to you a little bit about the efficient frontier. And we think there's going to be changes in every business, and your business will be no exception. And we think you will have to talk to clients differently than perhaps you have talked to clients in the past. And the way we used to put clients on an efficient frontier had some premises. And the premises were that fairly consistently you can get the long-term return from equities, which is 10%, and you can get something from bonds, and the most common portfolio that was used was 60% equities and 40% fixed income, and that got you a standard deviation, round numbers of 10, and the financial planning people talk to their clients about that. So we went back to the beginning of the S&P and looked at sequential decades and then sequential 20-year periods, and the numbers may surprise you. And our conclusion here is that the 80s, the 80s and the 90s skewed all these numbers and made people comfortable, and they didn't look past them, just like they're not looking past the stuff that's going on. The S&P compounded at 7% in the 60s, 6% in the 70s, 17% in the 80s, 18% in the 90s, minus 1% in the decade of the zeros, and 13% in the tens. We also included the 20s. We used Rob Arnett's work at Research Affiliates, which suggests it's a 1% return for the 20s. So if you combine 20-year periods, so the 60s and 70s, assets compounded at 6.5. 70s and 80s, 11.3. 80s and 90s, 17.5. 90s and zeros, 8. Zeros and tens, 5.9, and tens and 20s, 6.5. So if you look at 10-year periods, there's 7 periods, and only 3 of them did you get 10%. And in 20-year periods, there's 6 of them, and only in 2 of them, and they were sequential to, did you get 10%. So what you need is something that will get you, for your core equity strategy, more consistent returns over periods. We didn't do it any longer than 20 years, and here's why. We think a lot of clients will give you 10 years, and we think a fair number of clients will give you 20 years, and you don't have a client who will give you more than that. If we did this in 50-year rolling periods, what you'd see is it all works. It just doesn't work in very long periods. So we went back and looked at the same data, same periods for dividend strategies. So there's two points of data that we use. We use Jeremy Siegel's reconfiguration of the S&P based on companies who contributed to the dividends of the S&P. So he took the top 20% of companies who contributed to the dividends of the S&P, weighted them, and that's the stocks he bought, held them for a year. And then over the last 20 years, we used our data. So these are the numbers. In the 60s, 10.5. In the 70s, 10.4. In the 80s, 19.9. In the 90s, 21.1. In the zeros, 7.7. In the tens, 9.2. And what we did is to take our portfolio and just put in the cash flow of 5.5%, which is what you get if you start with a 4.4% yield, which the portfolio has right now, and grown it just 25 basis points a year. We've grown it 9%. So you have 7 periods there. 4 of them get you the return, and 1 of them gets you 9.2, and the other 2 are 7.7 and 5.5. I'll give you, I don't think the 5.5 is actually going to be that low. I think it's going to be a higher number, but even 7.7 isn't bad. If you did the same thing in 20-year periods, 60s and 70s get you 10.4, 70s and 80s 15, 80s and 90s 20, 90s and zeros 14, and zeros and tens 8.4. So in a 20-year period, you're still kind of okay. So I point that out because coming out of this, we're going to need to talk to our clients differently. And the focus on dividends rather than an attempt of appreciation is going to be one part of it. And that's the core strategy. So the other thing that I think we're going to need to do is to learn from the FAM stocks and hire managers who will get us, for at least some clients. Our suggestion really is that for all clients, disruptive technology portfolios. So let's just talk about a little bit about the things we've discovered about what the world might look like 10 years from now. But before we do that, let's just go back 10 years. So why didn't we buy, or why didn't you folks overweight the FAM stocks? Because in the decade of the tens, $100 turned into $350 in the S&P, and it returned into $3,790 in the FAM stocks. And I think the real answer is that we just didn't believe it. And my guess is that that's your answer as well. So, but all of this was based on 4G. And so let's just take retail. We didn't believe Amazon would become what it became. We didn't believe that we'd be as dependent on ordering things and getting things in a day or two as we were. And so, and you can kind of go right down the list. Sure, we Googled, but now we would, it's a verb. We wouldn't live without it. We carry around an iPad that has more capabilities than it did then, and you can kind of go to Facebook right down the list. But 5G is thought to be 100 times faster than 4G. And so this is just a list of some things that the research that we've done has uncovered about what the world might look like 10 years from now. I will tell you that it sounds a little bit like a science fiction movie, but it's not going to be a science fiction movie. And this is just to point out what the need, there is a need for disruptive technology in clients' portfolios. So 5G is really the biggest thing. The best example of 5G is this. India distributed 1.2 billion, they have 1.3 billion people, but 1.2 billion, what we call Social Security cards connected to a bank in about 2 years using 5G technology, and it has facial recognition and thumbprint recognition. It's just how it's going to change. 5G is also going to allow for that combined with satellite technology for everyone in the world to be connected to the internet. There's 3.8 billion people right now, and in 5 years, it's estimated there'll be 8 billion. That is, everybody will be connected. So what do we know about those those 8 billion people. It's kind of easy to say if you don't have internet, you're probably not going to contribute, but there is an example of this. And the people who run the X Prize put out an X Prize for the development of a tablet that would teach self-tutor people to get to the 5th grade math level and 6th grade reading level. And so, because they were tablets, they could monitor what was done. They were in packages. And many of the places, a lot of this was sub-Saharan Africa, and many of the places, they don't see packages, so they didn't even know what the packages were. But 2 weeks later, on average, the people who were using this, where literacy is a huge problem, were doing 6 lessons a day. And in a month, somebody rewrote one of the programs. So that just tells you what the addition is. There's geniuses out there who simply are born in the wrong place. If they were born in Chicago or New York or Iowa or any place else in this country, we'd know who they were. CRISPR technology will impact our health, and the way it'll impact our health is this. We'll go from thinking about, I need to go to the doctor when I'm sick, to I need to monitor my health every day. And there's lots of ways that technology is going to help us. 3D printing, right now, there is a company that can 3D print a prosthetic arm for $100. And the reason that that's important is that if your 6-year-old loses their arm, they probably need 2 or 3 arms every year for a number of years as they grow. And that's just the beginning. We haven't done that yet with 5G. There's 3D printing of houses, the small houses at a cost of $10,000. It could be disruptive in ways that we haven't even thought about. We'll all be using autonomous cars. Tesla right now is ready for autonomous cars to be used. What has to happen is that we have to get government approval. Tesla has said actually that the United States at the federal level is very open to all of that. And so cars are going to cost less. We're probably not going to own them, and they're going to be on demand. Artificial intelligence, frankly, I don't understand very well, but the way to think about it is, if any of you have ever been in an Amazon Go store, you put the app on your phone, you walk in with your phone in your pocket. It automatically scans you. You go what you want and you walk out. So that's what the future is. We're not going to be, you're going to go to the grocery store, load up your cart and go out. Elon Musk has said if any company does not use artificial intelligence, they'll be out of business. So will we be using artificial intelligence 5 years from now to help build portfolios? Maybe. Maybe. I don't know the answer to that. Artificial intelligence also, there's an example of the game of Go and the game of chess, how in 24 hours the computer could beat the best in the world. There's a company called Lawgeez, Lawgeez, and it's contract analysis. So they did a test. They gave a whole bunch of lawyers some contracts with errors in them, and the lawyers on average took an hour and a half to find 85% of the errors. The artificial intelligence took 26 seconds to find 94%. We will be using drone technology, and that does seem like, science fiction, but we will be doing that. And the estimate is that you're going to order your lunch at your desk, and you're going to walk outside with your phone, and the drone will land there. You'll take your lunch and it'll go. Right now, that technology is thought to cost $5, but it's thought in between 5 and 10 years, it'll cost 20 cents. So all of that is important because we're going to have huge differences in the way we have to think about portfolios. There'll be an acronym for the group of stocks, you know, sometime down the road, 5 years, 7 years from now, 10 years from now, but it's not going to be FAM, it's going to be something else. So let me just stop there. You can just raise your hand if you have a question on something. I think St. John had a question about when are we going to have all of this put together in new portfolios, and the answer is, so we've written 10 two-page things on all of the changes, all of the premises, and so that will be available to you next week. Included in there will be some S allocation thoughts, but we're going to have to work with each of you on the development of specific models to put together for your clients. So I think that's really a July task. So, okay. Any questions? So I've either bored you. I know you're not too shy, so it doesn't look like anybody does have a question. Okay, so if you have questions, send us a note. I just want to say that we're going to have agendas on these meetings from now on. We're going to take what we've just written and kind of go through 1 or 2 of those a week. So that'll take the next 6 weeks or something like that. That's that. So any rate, I hope everybody stays well. Welcome to reopening. If you're in Chicago, you can go to a bar and you might have a good time, you might not. It won't be the same as it was. And we look forward to talking to you next week. Thanks.